Okay, good evening, everybody. My name is Alex Israel, and I work for Machon Pardes, the Pardes Institute of Jewish Studies here in Jerusalem. And we're really delighted to be hosting this event this evening. It's going to be, I think, a fascinating and, as Elliott and Nechama have assured us, a very frank and open discussion about important issues about relationships, sexuality in our world. I just want to introduce those of you who don't know to the Pardes Institute of Jewish Studies. We are an institute for higher Jewish learning, where we pride ourselves that Jewish learning is accessible to all. We are open to all students of all ages and denominations, and we try and create a vibrant environment of Jewish study, discussion, and practice. And I'd like to invite people to check out our Pardes Daily app on your app store, where we have special classes which are for Purim, and we have a range of Talmud and Halacha and Tanakh classes in advance of Purim. So I just like everybody to know that they can avail themselves of that opportunity. I am going to, because we're starting maybe 3 or 4 minutes late, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Elliott Malamet, who is going to introduce the evening and is going to present the issues that we're going to be discussing and engaging with for the next hour or the next hour and a half. We'll see how long the discussion continues.
Thank you, Alex, and welcome everyone. So Purim tells the story of a young and innocent Jewish girl who is suddenly inaugurated into a world of patriarchy and power. And she's faced with issues of her own agency and the ability to navigate a male-dominated world politically and sexually. So what we're interested here is both that ancient narrative and also some of the current dilemmas that confront young Jews in an evolving sexual universe, from the pervasive influence of digital media to hookup culture on college campuses, to the challenge of learning to integrate sexuality into a framework of deep emotional commitments. We also want to consider how Judaism and Jewish education can respond and provide a relevant model for Jews who are looking for spiritual guidance and wisdom in conducting romantic and erotic relationships in an ever-changing world. So we have a lot of ground to cover this evening. If you have a question you'd like to post in the Nechama, send it to the chat box. We'll see if we can get to it. I can't promise. I don't know if we will, but we'll try. So Nechama, let's begin with an issue in the Megillah that speaks directly to a hot topic in the discourse about sex in the modern world, which is that of agency and consent. I remember listening many times to rabbis and teachers describing what took place in the second chapter of the Megillah as a beauty pageant. Whereas in my eyes, and the way I've taught it for many years, the appropriate cultural analogy is sex trafficking, the human slave trade. Because what you have is that women are essentially the patriarchal property of the empire. And with the exception of Esther herself, they completely vanish. And in that second chapter, we read of the countless virgin girls who are trafficked by the king's officials, abducted from their homes across the empire, transported to Persia, held captive in the king's palace, so that he can engage in non-consensual sex with each of them until he determines which one satisfies him best sexually. So these vulnerable girls are basically kidnapped, then they're imprisoned in the king's palace and monarchically raped. So the Megillah is a very dark text for women, and the supposedly happy ending in which Jews avoid a genocidal order does nothing to soften this. So Nechama, let's begin. I'd like to ask you first to comment on Esther sleeping with Achashverosh. Do you think the Megillah sees her as a victim? Do you think it sees her as a kind of proto-feminist, shrewd operator who figures out how to manipulate the system? Both? Neither?
Okay, I'll jump in and thank you, Elliott. We've been trying to have a conversation like this for some time, so it's actually very gratifying that we're having it on the eve of Purim. Like you said, the Megillah brings out a lot of questions about Jewish texts today and how we engage with them. And so I'm not going to immediately answer your question. I'm going to broaden it by saying this is really one of many, many texts in the Tanakh that involve sexual violence. Meaning when I was sitting and thinking about consent and Esther, I mean, Esther is one of the later books, but if I think about the book of Bereshit and how we handle the stories of Sarah and in Pharaoh's harem, how we handle Dinah and Shechem, Tamar and Yehudah, Potiphar's wife and Yosef, which is an unusual story because it's a man being sexually vulnerable to sexual harassment, very unusual. But we certainly have a series of stories later on in the David narrative with Bathsheba, with Abishag. And I'll just say, as an educator, it's gotten increasingly difficult for me to teach some of the more violent stories. And as someone who grew up in Orthodoxy, and so these stories were kind of, what I was taught as a young child in second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth grade, seventh grade, eighth grade. There's a familiarity that comes with encountering the story with regularity. And there are moments where suddenly it hits you that these are very dark and complicated stories. And for the modern reader, particularly, Alex mentioned Pardes is a beit midrash that welcomes everybody, but it's not only men and women coming from outside of Orthodoxy. Sometimes it's my 18-year-old students who suddenly read the story and say, wait a minute, what's going on here? This is very disturbing and very troubling. And so I feel like Esther is one of many stories that I have to think how to frame and how to present so that I both have an integrity in teaching the text and don't slide into any sort of apologetics or ignoring some of the darker sides of the story. I'm all for interpretation, and I do think people should try to find interpretation that speaks to them. And for some people, it's going to be a softening of the more violent elements of the story. And I understand why some people are drawn to that. But as a feminist scholar, as an Orthodox Jew, as someone who essentially makes her living and her life learning and teaching the texts of my ancestors, I feel that I cannot ignore that. And I'll just share a story briefly. I went to London to do a pop-up beit midrash with a psychologist, and we decided we would teach Yehudah and Tamar, which to me is one of the best stories. It's about female empowerment and using her sexuality to liberate herself. And I remember it was a room filled with women, most of whom were not Orthodox. And there was so much anger and suspicion. And it was a moment where I realized how complicated these texts are when you first hear them and the way it presents women. And so now I'm going to segue back to Esther. I mean, Esther is the heroine of the story. Yes, she ends up learning to use her beauty. And I often use this in the series of beauty in the Bible classes I give, that beauty is a challenge and beauty is a danger. And all of the stories in which someone is beautiful, man or woman, there's a danger to the protagonist, either a danger that they will be corrupted by their beauty or a danger that they will be overly noticed for their beauty. And Vashti and Esther fit very well into that paradigm, both of them. And of course, Vashti has to exit so that Esther can enter. But one of the things I didn't notice until I was well into adulthood were the betulot sheni, that even after Esther becomes the queen, she is unable or unwilling to stop the parade of the virgins. And when you think of it, you realize they're very young girls, because in the Persian Empire, they're getting married at 12, 13, 14, as they are in the Mishnah and Talmudic text, 15, 16, like very young. And that's the end of their life, essentially, because once you enter the king's harem, there's no exiting. And so your life essentially ends at that moment, and you have no agency. Your parents had no agency, right? They had no way to prevent it. Esther has no way to prevent it, and it continues. And I feel that's one of those verses that we really don't pay attention to. The first time they're gathered, it's so that there be a queen, right? But now there's a queen, and they're still being gathered and paraded in and out of the king's bedroom. And it is a very complicated story. And I think Esther is both a heroine and a victim simultaneously. One does not preclude the other.
I mean, you raised something interesting that I think people are really unaware of, which is the mechanics, the logistics of what goes on in the palace. And again, I think what happens often, when you think about reading text, there's two ways of reading them. especially something like Megillat Esther. There's a way of reading it that's holiday connected, and there's a way of reading it kind of academically where you read it during the year. When you read it on the holiday, that night, right, so everybody's in a kind of festive mood. I feel like they kind of skirt right over the troubling parts of the text, and they just want to get to the food often. But if you take a look at it more seriously when you have time, so it's just horrifying, because what you have is a situation where people are kidnapped off the street, they're brought to the palace, they're prepared for a year in the first harem. Then suddenly one night, these young girls, you're right, 12, 13, are brought in, they sleep with this older man, and then they're discarded, basically. They go to the second harem, which is kind of the discard pile, and their life is frozen because you're never going back to your life and you can't be with anybody else. So there's this paralysis that sets in. I'm curious what you think about the history of interpretation of this text, because to me, it sort of screams out at me. But often I felt in education like it just wasn't talked about. Do you think that Jewish commentaries and communities tend to avoid or kind of downplay the real horrors of the story dealing with the suppression of women?
I think that for several thousand years, this was just, this was another story about salvation, how even with God's overt presence, ultimately we prevailed. And I will say that women are obligated in reading the Megillah and listening to the Megillah, because Afhin Hayubo Tohane, says Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, right? This moment in the Talmud where they recognize the centrality of women in the narrative, whether because of Esther, that's one suggestion, or because women were spared annihilation. And so I think that the story ultimately for thousands of years was one of salvation. And I think what you're doing, Elliott, and what I do as well, is relatively new, meaning to suggest that the authors of the Megillah, the authors of the Talmud, right, post-Talmud, could bring that critical attitude towards interpretation is anachronistic. In other words, I think that texts evolve from where they start, and it takes time until there's a sense of questioning the moral fabric of the text, or what we're supposed to learn, or how we're supposed to wrestle with the questions. But I was talking to my husband tonight about difficult texts, and we mentioned, if we look at David and Bathsheba, and that Natan Hanavi says to King David, you committed adultery with another man's wife and you had him killed. So Natan calls him an adulterer and a murderer, and then Chazal in the Gemara have a really hard time with that. And then, of course, they say, whoever says David sinned, Eino Ela Toel, which is, to my mind, interpretive, right? It's their way of interacting with a very complex text. So I think the reality in which you are asking the question and I am reading the text and asking the question, I think it is it's the result of the last 50 to 100 years of interpretation. And I think also where we are. I mean, we're in #MeToo. We're in complete awareness of white slavery and female disempowerment and subjugation. And so I think it's very powerful that a 2,500-year-old text can bring us to those conversations through learning, right? To me, that's actually wonderful that we can use these very ancient texts as if they're still alive, because they are for us. And we can now ask different kinds of questions.
So let's segue to that modern moment for a bit,
Okay.
to the contemporary landscape of consent. There's been a lot of recent discussion on what consent looks like and what happens when it's ignored. There was a book that came out just about a year ago called Sexual Citizens, which was subtitled Sex, Power, and Assault on Campus, in which Jennifer Hirsch and Seamus Khan collected the findings of years of research that they did on the sexual realities of college students. And they found, and I found this quite surprising and illuminating, that college students often take factors that have nothing to do with consent to mean permission to have sex. Here's one example that I found shocking. One student said, a woman said, I honestly just think that he, the man, thought that because I was staying over in his apartment, it was consent to get involved in something even though I was asleep, which I think was fairly common, that people were kind of like, and here she quotes a typical attitude, quote, I know definitely what consent is, but let's be real. You're here, so you want this, obviously, unquote, which she says is horrifying, but unbelievably common. It's shocking, she says, how often physical presence is consent in people's eyes, which is just so stupid, she says, but so common. So what happened is that the researchers found that people often consent to sex without ever saying yes. And a lot of consensual sex happens that students themselves describe as, quote, kind of rapey, unquote, which doesn't sound very enjoyable for at least one of the parties. Some students do practice affirmative consent, meaning they actually say yes, but many others, the researchers found, frequently assume that someone choosing to be alone in a room with them already signifies consent. And the authors found that students, to their own surprise, realized that they may not have gotten consent ever within their past sexual interactions until the moment they were interviewed, and then suddenly it dawned on them, wow, that wasn't consensual. So Nechama, I'd like you to share, based on your obviously pre-pandemic visits to campus and your ongoing educational work, what you think is going on with consent today, and what sorts of things you would say, for instance, to students and young people about how to take charge of their agency.
Yeah. Wow. Very heavy topic. Good segue from Esther. I'll say two books that had a tremendous impact on me were Peggy Orenstein's excellent research, and she's a journalist. She's from Philadelphia. I'm from Philadelphia, so I was drawn to, I identified with a lot of the book, but also where she was from. She wrote two books. One was called Girls and Sex, and then several years later, maybe it was like 5 years later, she came out with Boys and Sex. And in these books, she interviewed a lot of college students, like 11th, 12th grade, and then college students, about the sexual culture on college, in high school and in college culture. And what was shocking was twofold. Number one, the amount of drinking that girls have to do to go to pre-game before they go to a frat party or to any party, recognizing that there are going to be expectations, and the only way to kind of get through the expectations is to be 4, 5, 6 shots in before you even get to the party. That was very, very sad to read, and very indicative a little bit of what you're talking about, this awareness that I'm going to be expected, and then maybe I just don't want to have to think about what's going to happen, this mindlessness. And even more shocking and more disturbing was the Boys and Sex book, because at least with girls, there is talk about danger and assault and so on. But with boys, there's no conversation whatsoever. Parents are talking less to their boys than they talk to their girls. And I'm gonna loop it back to what's going on in the Jewish community. But allow me this, because these were actually very significant when I read them. And that this idea of what consent is, what it looks like beyond yes is yes, no is no, is something, boys are taught even less than girls. And I think we make a mistake as parents, as educators, as rabbis, in not thinking that young adults need modeling as to what healthy, consensual, pleasurable sexual relationships look like. And that doesn't go away when they're in a relationship or when they get married. Meaning these questions of how much do I have to give my partner when I'm not in the mood, when I'm tight, these are questions that maybe leave the arena of this kind of, was that rapey, and so on. But this question of what does healthy, pleasurable sexuality look like is something that I think, we are remiss in not discussing, or not allowing our children to ask the questions. And in Boys and Sex, meaning over and over, this macho culture, this locker room culture, this objectification of what a woman's body represents for a man, and getting it on and scoring, even the language, which is so verbally aggressive, it very much permeates what young men think they can ask of young women. And there was one powerful chapter where a young man essentially was pressuring a young woman over and over and over again until she finally, said yes. This idea, well, she consented, but is that consent? And he goes through a whole transformation, because he finally listens and realizes how manipulative he was being. And unfortunately, I've been sent many podcasts, with this kind of environment where a young woman says no and no and no, not just in college, post-college in their 30s, hanging out with a guy friend, no, 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 and then finally, okay, whatever, let's get it over with because you're not leaving me alone. And I feel that something is very wrong, and in the sexual culture that on one hand is very very permissive, on the other hand doesn't seem to be able to teach any sort of boundaries, guidelines, values beyond, well, it's all okay, just use birth control, dear, or don't get an STD, or go get AIDS tested, or make sure someone's not saying no. And so I would say, now taking it to the work that I do and what I see, when you throw religion into the mix, it becomes in some ways even more complicated, because it creates cognitive dissonance, in that if I have religious young adults who are not supposed to be doing anything before marriage, particularly the ones who are committed to only marital sexuality, and they find themselves in situations where they're not being shomer negia, right, where they're not able to keep the halachic boundaries, then this cognitive dissonance of I'm not doing what I'm doing leads to, obviously, absolute lack of consent, mindlessness, and so on. And that is something that I work very hard to help students create healthy boundaries. And I don't like to use the language of sin and you're well, you're not being shomer, so you're sinning. No, I'd rather talk about, I'm making a non-halachic decision here, and now I need to be accountable and own it and be aware of what I'm doing. Because the dissonance, the lack of awareness, leads to a vortex that's very hard to pull out of, and look long and hard at what I'm doing. Do I like it? Does the person like it? Am I putting pressure on the partner that I'm engaging in this with? And that concerns me tremendously for my young Orthodox students. And I hope we'll get to talk a little bit about that.
I want to pick up on a couple of strands that you've articulated here. The first one, which I think is so important, is the part in early childhood and later adolescence, because what the researchers found is that part of the problem with lack of clarity about consent is that the sort of boundaries and open sort of dialogue about sex, which would lead to a kind of informed understanding of what people are doing, was completely lacking in homes. And I'm sometimes stupefied about it, because it's almost as if parents believe that if we don't talk about it, they won't know about it. But in fact, especially in the internet age, if you don't talk about it, they're still going to know about it. They're just going to know about it from elsewhere, basically from porn or from advertising and a mixture of other cultural elements. So that we're going to talk about a little bit later, about how we educate people about sexuality. But I did want to pick up on the other strand you're talking about, which is, in a way, whether orthodoxy kind of boxes people in, especially young people in, regarding sexuality. And I wanted to talk to you about that, because as you well know, all studies for the past, say, 30, 35 years show that contemporary adults they're dating longer, they're having sexual relationships at a much younger age, they're marrying later than people did in previous generations. And some of that obviously has to do with birth control, which severed the automatic link, between sexuality and pregnancy. Some of it pertains to different personal ethics in the wake of the sexual revolution. And obviously, all of this cannot have failed to have had an impact on Orthodoxy and young Orthodox Jews. So I wanted to ask you, how do traditionally minded young Jewish men and women work this out, especially the problem of sexuality in the face of later marriage? Let's review a couple of options here. If the answer is, avoid sex, marry young, then obviously there is a problem, the problem of whether the individuals are emotionally, not to mention financially, ready for that commitment. And if we say, no, wait a few years until you're ready, then how do you reconcile that with burgeoning sexual pressure, especially in the wake of the halakha's prohibitions on premarital sex? It seems like they're caught between a rock and a hard place. So, Nechama, what are your thoughts on this?
So, that's the conundrum. I mean, ultimately, when I go to speak at a college campus, I often start off as follows. I'll say, look, here is, in 2 sentences, the halachic position on sexuality. The only sexuality that is permitted is marital heterosexuality using a mikvah, right? So that the woman is not prohibited with what we call nida, right? With menstrual prohibition, which maybe we'll get into, maybe we won't. And that's it. That's what Judaism has to say about it. There is nothing else. And as you pointed out, and I always say, let me get this, I don't want to be misquoted. The rest of my talk is going to be about non-halachic choices and creating boundaries and using Judaism's wonderful values about sexuality, which include respect and consensuality and pleasure and so on, to build a sexual ethic when you make a non-halachic choice. But let me be very clear, halakha is very clear. There is no sexuality outside of the marital heterosexual framework using mikvah. Meaning I'm very clear about that. I actually, I'm not going to start what's rabbinic and what's biblical and should not single women use the mikvah, which maybe sometimes they should, but let's be very clear about what Judaism's halachic position is and what its ideal position is for the framework of what we'll call kosher sex, to paraphrase Shmuley Boteach's book, right? This idea that Judaism is wonderfully empowering about sexuality, which isn't really true. Judaism has a very mixed history, very mixed messages throughout the sources about sexuality, some of which are very positive and some of which are very negative, even within marriage, right? So it's not all uniform. So, when I start to speak, the realities that young people face today were unthinkable in the time of Chazal. Like you said, people are men and women getting married in their mid to late 20s is very normal, right? Boys and girls having, in modern Orthodoxy especially, having friendships, whether it's in the classroom or in camp or in high school or in college, this idea of some sort of mixed sex interaction, so that there is, kind of a sexual energy and a sexual chemistry as you grow up with the boys that the crushes you have and the thoughts and in both directions. And so I think these challenges are very different than anything you can really attest to in the literature, because a young girl would have stayed at home until she got married. She certainly wouldn't have gone off to college and then gone on to graduate school and begun interning at a bank or in a hospital or in a court. And the same thing, a man might have been older and he might have worked for a few years. And if there was sexual release, the Gemara is aware of prostitutes. The Rivash in the 15th century is aware that men go to prostitutes, but certainly that's not where our daughters, our sisters, and so on are going to be going. They're going to be carefully chaperoned so that they can get married young and with the honor and the dignity that is reflective of a Bas Yisrael. So the reality of people and the hookup culture and what are religious adults supposed to do as they spend the first 10 to 12 to 15 years of having active sexual feelings is something that most people don't want to talk about, not just parents, rabbis, right? It's kind of like, don't ask, don't tell, we don't want to know, we can't endorse it because it's halachically prohibited, and we can't pretend, so we're, on the other hand, to have a 35-year-old who's had no sexual experience marrying a 35-year-old, that also raises a certain amount of concern, as if we expect people who have spent 20 years repressing their sexuality to be able to jump into a sexual relationship. That's also complicated, and people will nod and say, yes, that's complicated. But I've been at many, many seminars of older singles who have turned to the rabbis and said, well, what do you want us to do? And at a certain age, if we don't have any touch or any physical intimacy in the dating relationship, can you really expect us to move into any sort of space where we get to know one another? I mean, we know that touch is a major love language. So at 21, 22, 23, maybe we can kind of slide into home base without it. At 33, there are many more layers of baggage, and I'm not trying, God forbid, to detract from those who may, who stay on what we'll call the straight and narrow. I understand the sacrifice and the discipline and so on. My words are meant more for those who struggle with the dissonance and the guilt and the shame and the conflict, and that can sometimes get in the way of recognizing how normal what they're doing is and having any sort of guidelines for that experience. So I
what
don't
do
know if you want to ask me
hypothesize?
anything. I have a lot more to say, but I'm happy.
Well, yeah, let's hypothesize, an actual couple comes to you and they're 21 and they are telling you that we're not going to be sexually abstinent. And why should we? We have feelings for each other. We want to express those feelings sexually. What would you say? In other words, how would you advise these people?
Yeah, I mean, that's not hypothetical, and I have those questions. One of the questions I've gotten not infrequently is oral sex, meaning in terms of my ketubah, right? Will I be a virgin if we're having oral sex? Which shows ignorance of both, we call it oral sex, but it's not penetrative sex. And so it has different connotations in halacha and so on. By the way, the Catholics, right? If you want to be a Catholic virgin, then that's what you do in order to, right? So we're not the only religion where young adults try to maintain fidelity to the religious values and yet are trying to find outlets for sexual expression. What I'll often say to 21-year-olds, I'm certainly not going to start talking about transgression and sin and kared, all those things. The kids who come to talk to me know very well what the halacha is. If they're coming to talk to me, it's because largely they have not succeeded in the boundaries that they thought they were going to keep. And more typical is we thought we were shomer. We're trying to be shomer. To be shomer means not to touch at all, to protect your hands from touching. And we're doing, when they start describing what's going on, I'm like, oh, I think it's time to admit you're not shomer, right? It's time to acknowledge what's going on so the two of you can make safe decisions, responsible decisions, respectful decisions, and not get caught up in the vortex of we're sinning. And so we can't acknowledge what we're doing, but we're doing more and more and more, and we're not doing anything, right? And so, all sorts of problematic situations can arise when I'm pretending not to be doing something, and yet I'm doing it, leading to, it can lead to pregnancy, it can lead to sexual activity that is far more intense or extreme than anything I imagined, but I'm shomer negia, right? So that more or less, when someone comes to talk to me, they want some help in creating boundaries, and they want a pastoral counseling so that they can not feel good about what it's not about feeling good or not feeling good. I'm certainly not giving them the rosary to say and 3 prakim of Tehillim. But what I am going to talk about is, again, encouraging a healthy communication so that there can be, and where is this leading? And is this about growing the relationship? And so on. Is this something that's healthy and consensual? Is this something that one person is pushing on the other? Certainly, if one person wants to be shomer negia and the other doesn't, that's a consensuality issue, right? And who is driving that conversation and how? So, the young adult, 21 to 31, who come to talk to me and upwards, are looking more for guidance because they know I won't be judgmental, and that I will try to help them where they are without trying to pretend that the conflict isn't real.
Which is good advice, and it's common sense. Of course, the elephant in the room here is that it's transgressive. I understand nobody's talking about it, but what occurs to me is, does Judaism need, in modernity, a new sexual ethos? One that actually converges more with the reality of what's going on in the modern world. I recognize that the pushback would be that it's just sort of surrendering to non-Jewish values. But I think that there's a more subtle discourse that can take place there where you say, I recognize where the pressure would come from the outside world, but we are part of the 21st century. And there are realities to the way young people grow up and the sort of extension of their educations, their work life, and so on. Do we need a new way of talking about this?
I think, so I'm gonna push back, in the sense that, you're smiling because yes, that's what we're good at. Yeah. Thank you. I'm gonna push back because I don't think we have to. Let me think of how to say this. I think the structure of mitzvah avera, reward and punishment, a structure in which there's aspiration to have boundaries in our relationship with God and with one another. I think that's important. Meaning, whether we want to change the language, I don't know. Meaning that's already an enormously big picture that little me cannot start thinking about. Are we going to, I don't want sexuality to become meaningless either. And I do worry. I do worry in this very promiscuous hookup culture, where, by the way, not as many people are having sex in college as we think they are, but still the culture is certainly a promiscuous one. The Tinder culture and the hookup culture and the fact, and I think, there was a great article in the New York Times that there's still inequality between the male sexual experience with hookups and the female sexual experience. Women do far better, for the most part, in relationships, with sexuality and relationships. And it was this article in a hookup culture, inequality still reigns. They surveyed something like 26,000 college students. And the reality is, the women had more enjoyable sex when they had a boyfriend or a partner or a steady partner. And so I don't want sex to become meaningless. I don't want it to be, as one student once said to me, junk sex, right? Like potato chips that you go through bag after bag and then you feel a little sick afterwards. I do think sexuality has the potential for something deeply meaningful. And in terms of the connection it allows us between one another, between two people. And I don't want to lose that. Meaning, I think that's something Judaism frames very well, and recognizing that sexuality is not bad and not dirty and not a necessary evil. But a lot of the Jewish sources talk about a dveikut and intimacy and the connection between the two people in the sexual relationship and how close it can bring them. And that pleasure is part of sexual pleasure is something to be celebrated. So I certainly don't want to lose those values in creating a Jewish sexual ethic. And at the same time, I think my most immediate concern is creating guidelines and resources that young religious adults can turn to get information, right? And to get information and to have conversations with people that they respect and can help guide them in making choices. And we're so far from any paradigm shift, right? That, like, first, let's have conversations acknowledging the reality we're having. And I feel like while it's gotten better in the last 10 years, and there's no question it's gotten better, that we have a long way to go before we get anywhere where we're ready to think about, wait, what are the numbers here? What are the percentages here? What's really happening here? First, we need to create better educational and rabbinic models to address what I see as an enormous need, and there is tremendous urgency. And I just, there's a great, it's kind of a funny podcast called the Jewish Blondes in the City, something like that. And it's the first few episodes were about a single woman, in Manhattan, and the dating and the expectations when she's dating within modern orthodoxy. And by the way, I've heard this over and over about divorced men, religious widowers who won't date, again, from guys, right? Who won't date women without the expectation of something sexual in the relationship. Now, again, of course, you're divorced, you're widowed, and it's not all of them, but I'm hearing this over and over, this idea, well, I'm not going to get burned a second time. I'm not taking a chance a second time. I need to know what that's going to look like. And no one's talking about, there's almost like a shocked in the rabbinic, like that's shocking that that's what's happening in orthodoxy. But, part of the problem is no one's really willing to acknowledge where this is touching people, right? That sexuality is a very normal, healthy need, that orthodoxy makes it's very, very limited where it can be expressed. And then what do we do with all these people who don't fit into that box? We haven't even gotten to, the LGBT, religious LGBT community. And what are we doing with that? So anyway.
I mean, some of the examples you said are slightly outliers, in terms of Tinder culture or widowers. I'm thinking more, I don't sort of relate completely to the binary you pose, so I'm going to push back against your pushback. Mm-hmm. I don't see celibacy as an aspiration in any stage of life. I mean, and I think celibacy is something that religion pushes on people often because it can't really solve the problem of sex. So it tells young people not to have sex, it tells LGBT people not to have sex. So essentially, we're telling everybody to avoid this sort of core part of their identity until they can fit into a certain kind of framework. And I'm not sure that that's acceptable advice at a certain point, because as I said, I just don't see that as an aspiration. I grant you there are all sorts of pitfalls and minefields here. But I think that the conversation has to be radically shifted. You mentioned something about, which I thought was thought-provoking. You know, what happens if you're 35 and you're celibate until then, and then suddenly you meet somebody, you get married, the sort of awkwardness of what sexuality would look like in that way. But I'm struck by the fact that this is true in a way of sexual education across the board, even with young people who are going to college classes about to get married. About 4.5 years ago or so, a report came out that was authored by a number of therapists, including Michelle Friedman and Rachel Yehuda, and it was entitled Observant Married Jewish Women and Sexual Life. And what happened is they sent out questionnaires to a lot of women, and they found that although almost all of their respondents studied the laws of niddah, menstruation, with a college teacher before marriage, they didn't feel the classes were that helpful in preparing them for actual married sexual life and their wedding night in particular. In fact, the focus was really on don't make halachic errors. And it turned out like few teachers apparently covered other topics, such as what sexual acts are permissible, how to prepare to engage in sexual acts that culminate in intercourse. And so one of the questions on the questionnaire was, what should your college teacher have covered? And the most common response that came from the women was that they'd wish they'd learned more about women's body parts, women's sensitivities, orgasm, different positions, what does a man's body look like, what to expect, how to actually consummate the marriage, like very basic core issues. So Nechama, I want to bring Esther back into our conversation to frame the topic. Esther is often depicted as kind of the good girl, right? Even her sex with Achashverosh is described in the Talmud as karka olam, right? Just a piece of earth. In other words, she wasn't into it, she was just passive. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering in actuality if this is really not the most helpful paradigm for the modern Jewish woman. Here's what I mean. In Friedman and Yehuda's study, the awkwardness, and you alluded to this earlier, of a sudden transition from celibate single life to fully sexual marital experience was actually lamented by many of the people who wrote them back, who said that it was hard to turn off their notions of being a good girl. One woman wrote, the difficulty we have in communicating needs verbally, I feel, is a result of the modesty and inhibitions we were shown as examples. So in other words, as another woman put it, the constant praise of how wonderful and holy sex is when saved for after marriage and only at certain times set up unrealistic expectations, and it actually avoided the physical aspect of sex. So the education they received made men out to be these sort of uncontrollable, purely sexual beings to whom women are powerless. And then you get married and you're supposed to trust that your husband wants to have sex with you because he truly loves you. They found it hard to change their patterns of thought. So I have a few questions for you here. Does this apparent contradiction between what the study describes as the awkwardness of this transition from celibate single life to fully sexual marital experience, does that raise red flags for you about how we communicate about sex in Orthodox Judaism? And what do you think these classes should really be focusing on with their clients?
Yeah, wow. So, you know, on one hand, I feel like a lot has happened in the last 5 to 10 years, addressing that, you know, exactly what that study brought up. It saddens me that this came out in November 2016. I'm not surprised. I'm aware of the reality. But the truth is, you know, since then, places like the Eden Center have done enormous work, Merkaz Yahel, to name a few, Nishmat with the OETSO program, Matan with the program they're running in Ra'anana. Meaning there have been a lot of women coming into the field, and learning more about sexuality and psychology and anatomy, and kind of upgrading tremendously the college teacher experience. And of course, in the States, the Maharats and Drisha, and, you know, there's been a lot of talk about this and a lot of work done here, and it's not enough. Meaning it's only the tip of the iceberg. And I would say I was just on a webinar that the Eden Center did the other night, and with sex therapists and questions coming in from the audience. And it was wonderful. It was a wonderful seminar, but I was saddened by how basic the questions were, and that there's still such a need for so much information. And this was geared at married couples, right? and questions of consent. I'm gonna, the question of, do I have to give in when my partner, has sexual needs and I'm not in the same place? And while the moderators and the speakers did a good job of trying to say, well, it's not about, no gender, we're not going to address gender, it was fairly clear from the questions that a lot of the people asking were women. And I think it speaks to something you said earlier, this idea that men have this enormous yetzer, right? That their entire lives, even in modern, not forget in the right-wing yeshivish or Haredi Hasidic communities, in modern Orthodoxy, women needing to dress modestly, women needing to not be too provocative, to not sing, right? In modern Orthodox communities, Kol Isha, because of the male yetzer. So suddenly then you get married and like you're suddenly face to face with this, what seems to be this, this voracious construct. And I'll say something interesting. I get a lot of women who are more sexually engaged or more sexually assertive or have more sexual needs than their husbands. And if you talk about a shift or a surprise or a shock, it's a shock to both of them, because all of the education has been about the men need, you have to like submit, we don't want him to waste seed and we don't want him to have sexual thoughts or look at other women. And so you need to be part of that process. Is when you're not nida, when you didn't, the mikvah, you have to be available because of the yetzer. And suddenly they get married, and not a small amount of couples find out that the women want to have a lot of sex, and good for them. But there's no, no one has talked about that. Is that normal? I mean, what's wrong with him? What's wrong with me? The female yetzer. And so, yeah, the need for good education, for remodeling, for bringing in Masters in Johnson and Rosemary Bassan and bringing in anatomy and talking more openly about what female and male sexuality look like, how the differences between female and male sexuality, how to create, again, boundaries and expectation and consent, right? How not to reject your part. Here you are in a relationship, but on one hand, you don't want to have to give in when you don't want to. There's consent. On the other hand, rejection is an issue if you're in a long-term relationship. And from the questions in the webinar, yeah, and these are, I hope, couples or women who have had better Kala teaching, and yet these questions persist. I would like to say, we're focusing a lot on the flaws or the lack in the religious community. I don't think it's better in the secular world. If anything, if we talk about what are the resources there and who are they turning to? They're not turning to their rabbis or their Kala teachers or and so on. So they're also, there are real challenges. Listen to Esther Pearl, right? Or I really like Stephen Snyder's book, Love Worth Making, meaning all you have to do is start reading some of the writings of sex therapists who are beginning to publish, kind of amalgamations of case studies. And you realize this is a major issue across the board, gay, straight, trans, religious, secular. The difference is, Elliott, is that we had a myth. And the myth was, if you were celibate until marriage and you follow Taras Mishpacha, you go to the mikvah, you're going to have great sex. And the reality is that's just not true. That's not true. A sexual relationship requires investment and work and communication. And it's true that some couples take to it like fish in water. But the shock, the real shock, was finding out that many religious couples don't enjoy sex, that there's not a good rhythm between them, that one has greater needs, that one, and so on and so forth. And that was the shock, because there was the idealization of the halachic structure. This will guarantee you perpetual happiness, the perpetual honeymoon myth, right? That does not do a service to couples who suddenly say, wait a minute, this isn't the way we're experiencing it. What's wrong with us? What were we fed? Where are the lies? And that's where I think good education, and there's been a lot of retraining, meaning I myself speak to both male and female Kala teachers. They always bring me in to give a talk similar to what I'm speaking about now. I'm a little more willing to acknowledge some of the moral complexities, the realities that these that married couples are facing, let alone singles, and the kind of couples I'm teaching who straight off the bat are already more honest with me about what they're going to be doing or not doing with regard to halacha. And I am hopeful. I am hopeful that there are a lot of good people in the field. There's Dr. David Ribner who's been in the field, and Dr. Batsheva Marcus, and Dr. Judith Fogel, and Dr. Naomi Marmon, and a lot of really good. I'm just mentioning my cousin Jody Waxpress. a lot of really great educated religious sex therapists who are bringing something new to the conversation and are working with the rabbis and the educators. So for me, that is hopeful.
You talked about education. Let's take it back a bit in terms of age. Can you sort of lay out for me, trace out for me what sex education would look like? When would it start? What would it involve? How graphic or euphemistic it needs to be, and so on. If you had your wish list, what would it look like?
Yeah, so, you know, if I had a wish list, and I've talked about this with my colleagues who sometimes will be, you know, not the ones I mentioned, the ones who are educators. You know, we started off talking about Esther, Elliott. And if I said to you in Tanakh, there are many, many stories that touch on sexuality, if we're willing to go there, whether it's Noah and what happens to him with his sons. We talked about Avram. We talked about, you know, all the stories in Bereshit. We can open Vayikra and go to the Arayot. We talk about David, who comes late, and it's thought that maybe he's a Keri, right? Keri Lila. He had a seminal emission. There are so many opportunities to accurately explain what's happening in our Jewish texts, in our narratives, in our biblical stories. The Mishnah and the Gemara, I would not be exaggerating to say every few pages, regardless of what Masechet you open, there is something that can be connected to sexuality. Recently, it was the Zav, right? The Zav, the Nida. If parents, if teachers would allow those to be real moments of explanation, and yes, I understand a second grader and a fourth grader and an eighth grader mean different ages, but allowing the child to say, what is happening here? And I'll just share one of my children. We were learning the story of David and Shaul and Yonatan, where David did not come. They were trying to figure out if Shaul was still in a murderous mood towards David. And Yonatan excuses David's absence by saying maybe he's Keri, right? He had a seminal emission. And I remember my daughter said to me, well, what does that mean? And I explained it to her. And then she asked, I remember 2 or 3 more questions to try to understand a little bit more. And at a certain point, she was done. She was in 7th or 8th grade. And I remember patting myself on the back. It was that moment as a parent where you're like, oh, I did this really well. It's only taken me a few kids to get to that. Like this comfort level of being able to explain to my child what is happening and give her language and give her information until she's had enough. And many people are not there. And, you know, I'm sometimes shocked. Doctors, professionals, right? It is very hard for them to talk to their kids about sexuality. And I think our Jewish texts, our Jewish language is so filled with it that we really have no excuse in not allowing the stories and the halachot and the discourse to lead us. So if you say to me, what's my dream? Let's start being honest about what the texts are saying. Let's allow our kids to understand and then ask the questions and answer them and create a dynamic in the classroom and in the home. And my oldest daughter, I have 4 daughters. My oldest daughter will say, you didn't teach. Of course, she's the one who makes, you know, likes to hold up the mirror to how many mistakes I've made in my parenting. But you know, you didn't talk to me about these things. But my other 3 will say, you talked to us. I mean, we were able to ask you literally everything. And we were able to come to you with questions friends had. And one of my daughters brought her 12th grade class to my house so we could have a censor-free conversation with girls finishing 12th grade anatomy, physiology, and so on. And I wish I wasn't unique, meaning I wish there were many, many, many more. Every parent could have conversations like that with their children. I think it would make an enormous difference.
I think to some extent, some of this speaks to the issue of training. One of the things that I've often been privy to in many years of training teachers is that students will say they asked a question, they didn't get a good answer, they didn't like the answer they got. And often I'll tell students, teachers teach often to the level that they were taught. That's an unfortunate reality because really the good teachers will go beyond how they were taught. They'll actually expand their repertoire, they'll keep growing, but sometimes they're limited to what they were given. So when you talk about parents having conversations with kids or teachers having conversations with kids, some of it comes to what they'll know. So do you feel there actually has to be some sort of formal training that goes on for people who are in these kinds of advising capacities, whether it's rabbis or obviously yoetzot who do know what they're talking about, and teachers, parents across the board, because it won't just come from nowhere.
Yeah, look, I can only, Dr. Yocheved Debo wrote a wonderful book about how to talk to your kids for religious parents, right? Because obviously the language in the religious community is different, right? It's a cleaner language, or it's a less explicit language, or it's more whatever it is, it has whatever values it has scaffolded in. And I think she wrote it something like 10 years ago. And since then, she's been revising it. But, I would like there to be 10 different, 10 different models of how to do that depending on the community. And I know people do go around to different communities. I know in the Moetzah Gush Etzion, the head of the Moetzah Dati goes around and talks to classrooms of boys, to parents. Yes, you're absolutely correct. The parents themselves have whatever conflicts, poor education, whatever baggage they're bringing into the conversation. But I really think if we go back to using the Tanakh, the story of Esther, allowing these stories to awaken the conversations, it's less threatening than, let me sit down and give you a talk of the birds and the bees. And it might happen more organically because it's within the framework of their religious values and texts and narratives. And I think that might be a good place to start if we're not afraid of it, right? So
right.
Yes, there's a lot of work to do.
Yeah, that seems quite logical to me as well. If people have questions, they can begin to send them into the chat.
Are you sure? Is the chat enabled because I saw that the chat had been disabled?
I think it's enabled now. Okay. I'm just going to ask you one other question, then we'll throw it open to the floor. We haven't talked about the LGBTQ community, and I'm wondering how you feel that Jewish educators should address sexuality, and should they explicitly address and concede the fact that some of their listeners are LGBTQ instead of sort of pretending that that's not the case?
Yeah, so, as you probably know, I have gay students, gay LGBT students, certainly through Pardes, but not only, also from Orthodox places I've taught. And I would say, this fear that if we talk about this, more of our kids will be gay is similar to like if we talk about options besides Shomer Negia, our kids are going to have more sex, is not helpful and is a bit primitive and doesn't lead to less. If anything, it leads to more dangerous or more concerning behavior. We know that the depression levels and the suicide levels of LGBTQ teenagers is very high, not just in religion. I mean, obviously, it also affects those in religion. And I would really like to see a more scaffolded conversation, similar to what I've been talking about this whole time. Because I'm not asking parents to relinquish their commitment to their religious values, their beliefs, but I am asking them to open up conversations and listen to their children and provide their children with resources and responsible information and safe spaces like the home, and try to hold both of those up one next to the other. In other words, I can have a child who is gay and say, okay, I have halachic issues, I have religious issues, and I love my child, and I certainly don't want my child to end up in, God forbid, trying to harm themselves or in unsafe places. And so I'm going to have to live with dissonance, right? We talked about the cognitive dissonance that I find concerning, where I'm mindless about my behavior. By the way, if there's a gay man or woman who is in mindless sexual behavior, and I've heard psychologists talk about this, right? Particularly a case study that stayed with me, a Haredi young man who's having unprotected sex, in town, with people outside of his community because he's not gay, right? I really don't want, that is mindless cognitive dissonance. The cognitive dissonance that I think is okay, and that I want to help parents and community people and so on reach, is I can have my religious values and beliefs and commitment to halacha, and I can still support my child and not worry that my child's going to think I have now become extremely casual and light about my commitment to halacha, right? This fear that if I accept my child who's not religious, who's gay, who's sexually active, that somehow they're going to think I'm tacitly approving of what they're doing. No, the reality is children know very well what their parents' commitments, values, and beliefs are. And children are able to say, I know my parent doesn't religiously accept what I'm doing, and my parent loves me, right? So this fear that if we're too relaxed about accepting our children, it's going to lead to our children thinking we legitimize. We never want our child to think it's okay, that we think it's okay. Children know very well what their parents think is okay and not okay. All they're looking for often is love and support. The approval can wait, right? They don't necessarily need approval, but they need the legitimacy to be able to come home and share with their parent and ask their parent for support and resources. And I'd really like to see more of that. I am not asking the religious community to start, whatever my personal thoughts, I'm not asking for halachic legitimacy at this point. What I'm asking for is resources for parents and community in order to create safer spaces for our young adults who are really at risk and are struggling.
It sounds to me that in some ways your work is very interesting. Your work works in this kind of tightrope or split screen between sort of what the law is and what the reality is, and you kind of skirt on in between. And there was a similarity to me about your comments about dealing with young straight couples as well as young queer people who are involved in figuring out their sexual identities. And that similarity is that I think that what you're trying to communicate to people is wherever you are on the sexual spectrum or whatever kind of sex you are having or anticipate having, that you want to inform it with a certain kind of value system. And I guess part of those values, to be explicit, are a kind of commitment to one another, a caring to one another, a mutual respect, and a consent, which takes us back to where we started, because one of the takeaways from the text is the lack of consent. And so wherever you are on the spectrum, I guess you're trying to communicate to them that if you get too caught up in the minutiae of what's right and wrong, you'll lose the forest for the trees. You'll forget about the larger values that you're trying to communicate. Would that seem accurate?
Oh, yeah, yes, thank you, because I think you reflected back to me very well what I have spent the last number of years trying to develop, which is that nuance. And people are often afraid of it, meaning as if, by having nuance, I'm somehow perjuring or corrupting the halachic system, or if I have nuance, then maybe I'm not going the whole way in endorsing, endorsing certain communities' behavior. I bring no judgment, really. I don't judge people's decision, but I do have a strong commitment to Jewish values and to halacha. And at the same time, I very much want to be there, and I want to respond to the urgency of the generation. And that is a lot of, like, you've reflected it back very well, a lot of nuance. And that's, holding that is sometimes very complicated for other people to hear.
Do you feel that there are values in religious texts that are difficult to swallow for contemporary people, or that there's something there for everyone? Like what would you see as something they should embrace, and what would you see as something that they're going to feel repugnance to?
Look, one of the questions I've been asked this, not once and not twice. I've been asked, if we're hooking up, should we use the mikvah? And something I didn't say explicitly, but maybe now I'll say it. If a couple comes to me, usually they're not 21. So I'm going to make it, usually they're older. They're in a committed relationship. They're not getting married yet. The sexual piece is significant in order for them to get to the other side to consider marriage. I've had this more than once. We're not going to get married unless we have some sort of sexual relationship. Should we use the mikvah? Right? So that's a serious question. It's a serious halachic question. It's a value and so on. But I will be there with them, and we can talk about the pros and cons and what that looks like. But if someone comes to me and says, "Look, I'm in the hookup, like I really like sex, different sexual partners. It's consensual. I'm very careful in every way in making sure that it's mutually pleasurable and so on. Should I use the mikvah?" So that's where I'll say, "Look, I'm not going to judge your decision. Your decisions sound like responsible decisions, and you're making them, and they're reflective of whatever choices you're making. But that's not a place where I would bring kedusha, right? I thought sanctifying sanctified sexuality, sanctifying the sexual relationship. And so I would not bring kedusha into that space. Whereas I would be willing to talk about kedusha, which really is about commitment, right? It's about separating oneself out. I actually once had a gay couple, a lesbian couple that I taught. They wanted to learn the laws of mikvah before getting married, and I taught them. These are my students, and I love them very much. And I said to them at the end, "Why are you doing this?" And you realize the entire halachic discourse revolves around a man and a woman. I mean, there's no way around that. It's about a man coming in unto a woman when she's nida. That's what leads to marriage. And I remember one of them turned to me, where she said, "Well, we're looking for kedusha in our sexuality, and this is the only model that there is really. And so we want to infuse our sexuality and our intimacy with holiness, with separateness." And that was very powerful to me. And I find that there are many adults looking for sanctity in intimacy and in sexuality. And yes, there's the halachic structure. Again, I'm committed to the halachic structure. And I think there are things we can offer so that their sexuality doesn't have to be hefker. I mean, I know that there is an organization that believes you cannot be religious and gay. So if you're not going to give up same-sex relationships, then you should go to Tel Aviv. You should become chiloni. That to me is that's very upsetting. It's very upsetting to me that has to be either be religious and celibate, right? Celibate, or marry a woman. We're talking about gay men, right? Marry a woman, or go to Tel Aviv and then don't have any pretense of being religious. Obviously, that's not a space that I live in.
Right. I mean, that's frankly not just upsetting, it's utterly ignorant, but we'll leave that to the side. Something you just spoke about a few moments ago twigged something for me, which is, do you think that not just Jewish communities, but the world at large just forgets about older single people, but is especially true in Jewish communities? Like there's already such a bias in the culture. I'm reminded of that Yeats poem, Sailing to Byzantium, which starts out, "That is no country for old men," right? Where he sees young people frolicking. And that just seems to be so imbued in our culture, is that, there's kind of cutoff point and then your shelf life has passed. And I wonder if your experience in Jewish communities is that the sexuality, the not just the sexuality, but just the need for intimacy and connection of older people kind of gets subsumed under this sort of mania to get people married when they're younger and so on.
So, I feel like I see some questions have come in. I want to give time to those questions. I will say as follows. I don't think so. Meaning, if we're talking about an older demographic, certainly, I'll talk about menopause and women who reach menopause. The urgency of these women, or the pain they feel in menopause, where they are kneed up for long periods of time, right? It's very painful. And you get women calling in their 50s who are going through this transition, and they want to be sexually permitted. And I feel like a lot of the work my colleagues who are yoatzot and answering questions, not just yoatzot, those who have graduated with some fluency in these laws, is around that demographic, recognizing that there's an urgency there as well. And there was a great tshuva that someone named Dr. Sharon helped. I'm forgetting her last name. I apologize. Dr. from Ranana. Sorry, Sharon. That, I think it was Rav Moshe, or maybe it was the Shevet HaLevi, was asked whether a woman could force her husband to take Viagra. He was probably close to 70, because as we know in Judaism, a woman is entitled to sexual relations, right? It's her right and his duty to provide. It's more complicated than that, but we'll go with the simple presentation. And the answer was yes, meaning that he had to continue to be able to provide her. And it seemed like he was resistant, right? So there it speaks again to that stereotype that men always need sex and women have to provide it. There are many situations where women want and need and desire, and certainly respectful and considerate, sensitive halachic authorities are familiar with that and will respond accordingly. And to me, that was a very moving tshuva, because it showed exactly what you're talking about. We don't think sex is only for the young. And if anything, often post-menopause or post-mikvah will be a time of re-engaged sexuality. The children are out of the house. Financial needs are hopefully less urgent, right? There's like a renewed honeymoon that psychologists talk about, not just in religious couples, but this idea of being able to attend to one another's needs. And I think Judaism is very aware of that and very supportive of that.
Thank you. We're going to just, if you have a little bit of time, we're going to open it up to the questions from the floor. One question is asking how you'd suggest, in relation to starting conversations about reframing the narrative in group context. And the writer is saying that they're thinking particularly about how to tackle hookup culture in youth movements, modern Orthodox youth movements, where Shomer Negi is often used to silence a lot of issues. Is there a way to open these issues in group contexts?
So open what up, Elliott?
I think that the premise here is that it's in some ways easier to have a conversation with individuals. You're just dealing with one person. We all know that group dynamics are somewhat more volatile and unpredictable. How do you frame these things with groups of people, especially if you think about like youth movements, right? You're talking about different parents with different sensibilities, all of their kids in the same room.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Look, I mean, when I go to college campuses, I speak to a room full of young men and young women, whoever wants to come to hear the lecture. Inevitably, by the way, at the end, there's always someone, whether it's a man or a young woman, who argues with me that I haven't advocated enough for the Shomer Negia, for the celibacy model, right? And I always remind them, remember that in the beginning, I always say the halal, but it's interesting. I find that many come up to thank me, both men and women, meaning that I've allowed for a conversation. Some will be in touch with me with follow-up questions. But certainly in college, parents are obviously not involved. And that's certainly, it's a little late, but it's not too late, because like we said at some point in this conversation, college is where it's really urgent to be having these conversations. Particularly about responsibility and responsible drinking. God forbid, no one should misinterpret me to think that if you're drunk, you deserve what you get. Absolutely, God forbid not. But I would want there to be a more honest conversation about the perils of drinking before having the tips that can be helpful and sometimes giving more agency in situations like that. But college is definitely the time where the JLIC rabbi or if only the Chabad couple, or they could bring in a speaker. But I do think by 11th and 12th grade, also in the more modern Orthodox environments, NCSY, I have to say, I don't know what they're doing today, but my experience in NCSY was for the entire time I was in NCSY, all we did was talk about Shomer Negia. I mean, there were no other sessions. That's what I remember. Are you Shomer? Aren't you Shomer? Or you should be Shomer. There was nothing else. And it was, on one hand, remarkably exciting to be talking about it, because we were actually talking about sexuality, but we weren't calling it by it was a little crazy. So if that's the only conversation, then we're not going to go anywhere. But given that a lot of these youth groups do advocate Shomer Negia, then maybe at the same time they could be having a more nuanced conversation and bringing in educators who are good at nuance. I mean, I've certainly been invited to speak, but more post high school on these topics. And so yes, I think in a group you can separate the boys and the girls that might be more comfortable, but certainly there are ways to be doing it.
There's another question here that I think actually asks something very pertinent, which is that we focused on certain horrifying texts in Tanakh that send a rather problematic message about sexual coercion and so on. And the writer is asking if there's a specific story that you know in Tanakh that you think sends a positive message about sex rather than a cautionary tale.
Yes, beautiful question. I'm glad you asked it. I would say, first of all, Rivka and Yitzchak, right? Where Yitzchak is mitzachek at Rivka Ishto. There's a beautiful, it's so short, it's so brief, where Avimelech looks out the window and sees essentially Yitzchak causing her to laugh, and it's understood that there's a sexual component, right? He's pleasuring her essentially. So I think if you're willing to go in there, that's a wonderful, wonderful space where there is positive sexuality. Shir HaShirim is interesting. There's a lot of interplay between the Dod and the Doda, but of course they actually never get together, so that's not simple. Are there any positive sexuality? That's a really beautiful question. I'm gonna have to think for a moment.
Yeah, the fact that we have to think about this is
the fact that I have to think about it, right? I will say there's the story of Leah going out to the field to take Yaakov back into her tent. So again, I like that it's about female sexual empowerment where Leah is being proactive, but the fact that I have to think about it means that it's not. Abigail and David, thank you, Karen. It is interesting because I wouldn't use that about positive sexuality. It's more like the Tamar and Yehuda, that Abigail essentially, after the whole story happens with Naval, essentially says to David, I want to be your wife. Meaning she's proactive in basically saying to David, take me, choose me, recognizing that that she wants someone like him as a husband. But I wouldn't, I'm not sure I would use that as a model for. I appreciate that there are biblical stories in which women are proactive about their sexuality when so many of the stories are about passive or abused sexuality. So I definitely appreciate that. But I'm going to have to think about that. The story of V'davak b'ishto v'yulu basar echad, right? The whole creation, Zachar and Nekeva. I certainly will use Breshit Aleph and Bet to talk about what the separation or reconnection can look like. There, I'll talk a lot about the beauty of sexuality and sexual intimacy. But anyway, yes, tough. That was a tough question.
Right until the part in Perek Gimel where Adam throws everybody under the bus, right?
Yes.
So I mean, one of the things that I think about when I think about this question is that observant Jews often feel the need to try and make everything that is there in the Torah kind of work positively in a modern context. And the fact is, you're trying to actually put something that doesn't quite fit all the time. Even the relationships you talked about are in some ways enormously problematic, Rivka and Yitzhak being one of them. I think this is a whole separate topic and an interesting one about how you would teach these things to actually inspire people to respect. I think in the Haredi world, they just sort of plow past it all and still use these as paradigms of wonderful relationships. But I think if you take a close look at them, in many ways, they're anything but. The way Avram uses Sarah in really egregious ways when they go to Mitzrayim, Rivka and Yitzhak not communicating with one another about their children, about their fate. Adam and Chava is, beautiful until he just says to God, well, it's, her problem, your problem, anything but my problem. So I think that there's actually a real issue in trying to draw paradigms about romantic, emotional intimacy from these people in 2021. And I, for one, don't feel really forced to do so. Whereas I think the rest of Jewish tradition actually does some really wonderful things post facto in trying to communicate that.
So, I'm going to interject for a moment because I think stories and we've got 2,500 years of interpretation of these stories and narratives and in the biblical text. And as I said, I think it's in 2021, we're engaged in this Tanakh B'Gova Ha'inayim, this kind of 929 assessment, critical assessment, being critical about the text. I think the text can take it. Meaning, I think it's fine and it's good. And I think it's a generation where we gain more by being perhaps critically honest about what the stories represent or what they're saying, and then trying to find layers of meaning underneath. But what I personally love about the stories is how relatable they are, especially in 2021. Because I think a lot of students today, a lot of interpreters today are drawn to, psychology and the psychology of the family and the relationships and how fractured many relationships are. And so I actually use these stories all the time. I hear what you're saying, and yet I find that they're often that there's so much within the story that's rich in plumbing the depths and coming out, looking honestly at how complicated the husband-wife relationship is, the parent-child relationship is. And I appreciate that there's no whitewashing. I mean, these are complicated stories, favoritism and loyalty and what do we do when, who do we sacrifice when someone needs to be sacrificed? Who's the vulnerable person in the family that gets sacrificed? And I think those are very powerful stories, and they're going on today all around us. We just use different language to discuss them. And so I'm actually not afraid of the stories, and I'm very inspired to teach them and try to find different layers of meaning. I do want to just add something. We've talked about what I struggle to find perhaps a story that has the romanticism and the intimacy that, again, is a 2020 or a 20th century invention. Remember, people are getting married largely not for love. They're getting married for childbearing, for practical, for financial, because two fathers decided the children should get married. What we're looking for in relationships today, And I think this speaks a little bit to the struggle in Nida today that did not exist perhaps before, is that couples need for one another, the intimacy that's formed, the friendships, the relationships. I think, I don't want to say it's new. Obviously, throughout the generations, there were couples that deeply loved one another and were committed, Tevya, to Golda, do you love me, right after 5 daughters and 25 years of washing his clothes and so on. But Shalom Aleichem presents that. But I think couples are expecting more from one another, which is challenging the intimate relationship emotionally and sexually. And this idea of having 12 days, which the traditional, it's a wonderful break and it's a honeymoon and then you reconnect, is not reflective of the intensity of the experience. And many couples feeling, wait a minute, we feel so alienated and lonely, and we don't want to be alienated and lonely, meaning that this is difficult for us because our what we're expecting from intimacy is very different than perhaps than what was expected before. And so it's very hard. Here's the nuance again. On one hand, I'm willing to read the stories where they are. On the other hand, I'm not willing to be quite so dismissive or critical. I'm willing to recognize that we have, when they were written is very different than when we're reading them. And yet I do think we can bridge the gap and turn that reading and that learning into something meaningful. And I think Judaism, we talked about consensuality and respect and so on. The Talmud also says drunkenness, right? You're not supposed to have sex when you're really drunk. Tipsy is okay, right? You can set the mood, but real drunkenness. There's a lot that Judaism is aware of the danger that in the imbalance in the sexual relationship, and how do we and the danger is often male to female, right? That's what a lot of these stories show. How do we redress that? By making it a woman's right and a man's duty. It doesn't mean that a woman can say consistently no, but at least the burden is on the man to make sure there's awareness of the woman. Drunkenness, right? There can't be rage. There can't be fantasizing about another woman, right? Not that fantasy is bad or problematic, certainly not today, but the question is, how do we moderate so that it becomes something that both partners feel safe and respected and cared for in the relationship? And I think, anyway, that's more or less what I would say. I know it's already gone. Elliott, you decide how many more questions.
We're done.
Okay.
So I just want to thank Nechama Goldman Barash very much for her energy and her passion and her articulateness in talking about these topics. And I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight for this discussion. You can check the Pardes website for all of their programming that is going on pre-COVID, during COVID, God willing, after COVID. So I want to wish everybody a Purim Sameach, and also to stay safe and take really good care of yourselves.